The January wind howled through Hogsmeade's narrow streets like a creature seeking shelter, rattling the warped shutters of the Hogshead Inn with insistent fingers. Inside, Aberforth Dumbledore moved through the gloom with the economy of someone who had walked the same path for decades, his boots knowing every loose floorboard, every dip in the stone floor worn smooth by generations of uncertain feet. The pub smelled of old wood and older secrets, of spilled mead and the faint musk of goats that no amount of cleaning could quite erase. Not that Aberforth tried particularly hard. The smell kept away the curious, and curiosity, he had learned long ago, was a luxury that cost more than most could afford. He lifted a glass to the lamplight, weak, flickering, the color of tarnished brass, and examined it for spots. Found 3. Wiped them away with a rag that had seen better days, though when those days were, even Aberforth couldn't say. The glass joined his brothers behind the bar, a mismatched collection of vessels that had survived wars, rowdy patrons, and his own occasional fits of temper. From the corner of the room, Ariana watched. Her portrait hung in shadow, small and easily overlooked among the water-stained walls and crooked shelves stacked with bottles of dubious vintage. An accident, anyone would think, that it had landed there. Just another forgotten scrap of family history, tucked into a forgotten corner of a forgotten pub. Aberforth knew better. He'd placed her there himself 15 years ago, when the weight of Albus's grand plans had finally driven him to claim this one piece of their shattered family. Let Albus have his towers and his schemes. Aberforth would keep Ariana close, where she should have been kept all along. Quiet tonight, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He'd stopped expecting answers years ago, though sometimes, in that space between midnight and dawn when the world held its breath, he thought he saw her eyes follow him. Trick of the lamplight, probably, or wishful thinking, which was worse. The fire in the grate had burned down to sullen embers. Aberforth considered letting it die completely, then thought better of it. The cold outside wasn't just weather anymore. It had teeth now, that cold. Teeth and a dark mark and the kind of certainty that made even the bravest pull their cloaks tighter. He jabbed at the logs with more force than necessary. Sparks fountained upward, casting brief, wild shadows across Ariana's face. For just a moment, she looked alive, looked 14 again, with that small, secret smile she used to get when she'd managed something particularly clever with her magic. Then the sparks settled, and she was paint and canvas again, and Aberforth was an old man poking at a fire in an empty pub. Not quite empty. The goats in the back room bleated, a sound somewhere between complaint and greeting. Aberforth's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. All right, I hear you. He left the bar, moving through the narrow doorway that led to what had once been a storage room and was now a makeshift stable. 3 goats regarded him with the unimpressed expressions that goats had perfected over millennia. The white one, Matilda, butted her head against his leg in greeting or reproach. With goats, it was often hard to tell the difference. Don't start, Aberforth told her, producing a handful of feed from his pocket. You've been fed twice today already. Matilda chomped contentedly, unbothered by the accusation. The other 2, Bess and old Thomas, though Thomas was actually the youngest, crowded forward for their share. Aberforth distributed the feed with the careful fairness of long practice, his weathered hands gentle despite their roughness. World's gone madder than usual, he told them conversationally. The goats, being goats, didn't seem particularly concerned. Albus is dead. Did I mention that? He had, of course, several times. The goats had heard all about it, about the funeral at Hogwarts that Aberforth hadn't attended, about the white tomb by the lake, about how his brother's grand plans had finally caught up with him at the top of the tallest tower. Fitting, Aberforth thought bitterly. Albus had always loved his towers. They say Snape did it, he continued, scratching Bess behind the ears. She leaned into his hand, eyes half closing in contentment. On his orders, supposedly. Albus's orders. Always orders with him. Always some greater plan. Nobody else was clever enough to understand. Thomas bleated, a sound of pure goat skepticism. My thoughts exactly, Aberforth agreed. But his hands had stilled in Bess's coarse fur, and his eyes had gone distant. Because the thing was, Albus had been clever. Brilliant, even, in that terrible way that mistook intelligence for wisdom and plans for principles. And if Albus had ordered his own death, then it was part of something larger, something that would cost more lives before it was done. It always did, with Albus. The sound of the front door opening snapped him back to the present. Aberforth straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his wand before he caught himself. Careful, always careful now. He returned to the bar, schooling his features into the particular blend of disinterest and mild hostility that kept most customers from lingering. A figure stood in the doorway, snow dusting the shoulders of a traveling cloak, face hidden in shadow. We're nearly closed, Aberforth said flatly. Then I'm lucky I arrived when I did. The voice was female, middle-aged, with the crisp consonants of someone educated at Hogwarts a generation or two ago. She stepped into the light, pushing back her hood to reveal iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun and a face that had learned to hide worry behind sternness. Aberforth recognized her. Millicent Marchbanks, or some relation. A professor, maybe, or a ministry official from the days when the ministry had still been worth the name. She moved to the bar with the deliberate casualness of someone trying very hard not to appear nervous. "Fire whiskey," she said. "If you have it." "I have it." Aberforth pulled down a bottle, poured 2 fingers into a glass with a crack running through it like a scar. 3 sickles. She placed the coins on the bar without haggling, which told him more than her words had. People who paid without question were either very wealthy or very desperate. She didn't look wealthy. The woman took her drink to a table in the corner. Not the darkest corner, which would have been too obvious, but dark enough. She sat with her back to the wall, facing the door. Old habit, that. Aberforth approved despite himself. He returned to wiping glasses, a task that required just enough attention to look busy while allowing him to watch everything else. The woman sipped her whiskey slowly, making it last. Her eyes moved constantly, to the door, to the windows, to the portrait of Ariana that she probably couldn't even see properly in the shadows. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The wind continued its assault on the shutters. The fire settled into a steady burn. Aberforth worked through his collection of glasses, finding spots that might or might not have been there, wiping them away regardless. Then came the knock. Not the usual hammering of someone seeking shelter from the cold, or the tentative tap of a customer uncertain of their welcome. This was 3 measured strikes, a pause, then 2 more. A pattern that meant something to those who knew what to listen for. The woman in the corner stiffened slightly but didn't turn. Her hand, Aberforth noted, had moved beneath the table. Sensible. He crossed to the door, unbolted it, pulled it open just wide enough to reveal a young man, barely more than a boy, really, with snow in his dark hair and fear in his eyes. "We're closed," Aberforth said, the same flat tone as before. "Please." The word came out as little more than a breath. "Please, I just need—" "Closed," Aberforth repeated. But his hand had moved to the door frame in a gesture that might have been dismissal or invitation, depending on how you looked at it. His fingers tapped once, twice, a pattern. The boy's eyes flickered with understanding or hope, which was sometimes the same thing. "My grandmother sent me," she said. "You might." "Don't know what your grandmother thinks I might do," Aberforth interrupted. "But you can come in out of the cold for a moment." "Just a moment, mind." He stepped back, allowing the boy to slip inside. Thin, Aberforth noted. Too thin. The kind of thin that came from weeks of missed meals and nights without proper sleep. The cloak that hung from his shoulders had been expensive once, but someone had removed the silver clasps. Anything that might catch the light, might draw attention. The boy stood dripping snow on the already stained floor, looking between Aberforth and the woman in the corner with the desperate calculation of someone trying to determine which was the greater threat. "Sit," Aberforth commanded, gesturing to the bar. "You're letting in the cold." He closed the door, bolted it. The sound echoed through the quiet pub like a promise or a trap, depending on your perspective. The boy took a stool at the bar, his movements stiff with cold, or fear, or both. Up close, Aberforth could see he was older than he'd first appeared, maybe 19 or 20. But there was a brittleness to him, a sense that he'd used up several lifetimes' worth of courage just getting here. "Butterbeer," Aberforth said. "Not a question." He poured it, warmed the mug with a tap of his wand, the only magic he'd performed openly in the last 5 minutes. A small, deliberate gesture that said, "This is still a place where magic happens, still a place where that's allowed." The boy wrapped his hands around the mug like it was a lifeline. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Aberforth leaned against the bar, arms crossed. "Your grandmother. She have a name?" "Augusta Longbottom." "Of course." Aberforth kept his expression neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes. Augusta was old guard, the kind who remembered when the Dumbledore name had meant something other than brilliance and betrayal. She'd known Albus in his prime and had never been particularly impressed. Aberforth had always liked her for that. "And you are, does it matter?" The boy's voice carried an edge of defiance that hadn't been there before. Good. Fear was necessary for survival, but too much of it made you brittle. "Suppose not," Aberforth conceded. "What does matter is why Augusta thought sending you here was a good idea." The boy opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes darted to the woman in the corner, who had returned to studying her whiskey with apparent fascination. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They're looking for me. The Carrows. I was at Hogwarts. I am at Hogwarts, but things there." He swallowed hard. "I can't go back. Not right now. Maybe not ever. Gran said you might know somewhere. Somewhere safe. Safe. As if such a place existed anymore." Aberforth felt something twist in his chest. Anger or pity or the ghost of a protective instinct he'd thought long dead. He looked at the boy's face and saw a dozen others. Saw Ariana, always Ariana, frozen at 14 and terrified of the world beyond their door. "Your gran gives me too much credit," he said finally. "I'm just a publican. Please." That word again, stripped of pride. "I can pay. Not much, but keep your money." The words came out harsher than Aberforth intended. He softened them with a sigh. "Drink your butterbeer. Get warm. Then we'll see." Behind him, in the shadows, Ariana's portrait remained still. But Aberforth felt her presence, like a hand on his shoulder, gentle and insistent. "He's just a boy," she seemed to say. "Just a frightened boy who needs help." "I'm not Albus," Aberforth said, though whether to the boy, the woman in the corner, or the portrait of his sister, even he wasn't sure. "I don't do grand plans or noble sacrifices. I'm just an old man with a pub and some goats." The boy nodded slowly, some of the tension bleeding from his shoulders. "That's all I need. Just somewhere to breathe, somewhere they won't look." Aberforth studied him a moment longer, then grunted. "Finish that drink. There's a room upstairs. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and the door locks. You'll stay there tonight. Tomorrow." He shrugged. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out tomorrow." The relief that flooded the boy's face was painful to witness. "Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." "Don't," Aberforth repeated. He turned away, busying himself with unnecessarily rearranging bottles. "Just don't draw attention. Don't ask questions. And don't expect miracles. I'm fresh out of those." From the corner, the woman had arisen. She placed 3 more sickles on her table, more than the drink had cost, and moved toward the door. As she passed the bar, she paused just long enough to murmur, "Augusta was right about you." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded like approval or accusation. The boy finished his butterbeer in silence. Aberforth handed him a candle and a key. "Upstairs. Second door on the left. Stay quiet." "I will. I promise." Aberforth watched him climb the narrow stairs, each creaking step a small betrayal of presence, in a world where presence meant danger. When the boy disappeared from view, Aberforth returned to his vigil behind the bar. The pub settled back into its familiar quiet. The fire burned, the wind howled. The goats, satisfied with their evening meal, made the small shuffling sounds of settling sleep. And in the corner, in the shadows, Ariana watched her brother with painted eyes that seemed, for just a moment, to hold something like pride. Aberforth poured himself a drink, the good whiskey, not the rot he served to paying customers, and raised it toward her portrait in a silent toast. "For you, girl," he whispered. "Everything's always been for you." The fire crackled its agreement. Outside, snow continued to fall on Hogsmeade, on Hogwarts, on all the scattered pieces of a world that had broken and was still trying to figure out how to mend itself. And in the Hogshead Inn, an old man stood watch over his small corner of it, keeping secrets and tending wounds and wondering, not for the first time, when exactly he'd become someone who helped rather than someone who hid. Probably around the same time he'd stopped being able to tell the difference. Morning came to Hogsmeade, wrapped in fog, the kind that clung to cobblestones and turned familiar streets into uncertain pathways. Aberforth stood at the grimy window of the Hogshead, watching shapes move through the grey, villagers starting their day, or Death Eaters on patrol, or simply shadows cast by nothing at all. It was getting harder to tell the difference. He'd been awake since before dawn. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't quite afford. not with a fugitive student upstairs and half of wizarding Britain looking for reasons to ask uncomfortable question. The boy, he still didn't know the name, didn't want to, had made no sound through the night. Either he'd finally found rest, or he'd learned the particular skill of silent fear. Aberforth understood both. The pub smelled of stale smoke and the faint sweetness of spilled mead that had soaked into the floorboards decades ago. He'd opened the shutters, just enough to let in the weak morning light, not enough to invite inspection. The fire from last night had died to ash. He'd rebuild it later when the coal became insistent enough to demand attention. Behind the bar, he set about the morning's work with the mechanical precision of routine. Glasses needed washing, properly washing, not just the cursory wipe they received most evenings. Bottles needed checking, counting, arranging in an order that looked random but wasn't. The floor wanted sweeping, though what was the point when it would be dirty again by noon? He swept anyway. Movement kept the mind from wandering into dangerous territory. From her corner, Ariana watched the dawn creep across the floor. The weak light caught her portrait's edges, made her seem almost three-dimensional for a moment. Aberforth found himself pausing mid-sweep, broom handle gripped tight enough to hurt. "He can't stay long," he told her quietly. "You know that. Day or two, then he'll need to move on. Can't risk it." The portrait, of course, said nothing, but something in the painted eyes seemed to ask, "Can't risk what? Getting caught or caring?" "Don't start," Aberforth muttered, returning to his sweeping with renewed vigor. "I'm not Albus. I don't collect strays and call it saving the world." The words rang hollow even to his own ears. There was a boy upstairs who would likely disagree with that assessment, assuming the boy survived long enough to form an opinion. The goats announced the morning with their usual chorus of demands. Aberforth abandoned the broom, grateful for the interruption. In the back room, Matilda was already plotting escape. He could see it in her eyes. That particular goat, cunning, that had gotten her into trouble more times than he could count. "Don't even think about it," he warned, distributing feed with practiced efficiency. "Last time you got out, you nearly trampled Mundungus Fletcher. Would have improved him probably, but it draws attention." Bess and old Thomas were more interested in breakfast than rebellion. They ate with the single-minded focus of creatures who understood that the world might be falling apart, but meals still mattered. Aberforth envied them that simplicity. He was checking their water, fresh, always fresh. Standards had to be maintained even in chaos. When the first knock came, not the coded pattern from last night. This was ordinary hammering, the impatient rap of someone who expected to be admitted without question. Aberforth's hand moved to his wand, then away. Careful, always careful. He crossed back to the main room, noting with satisfaction that no sound came from upstairs. The boy had good instincts, at least. Aberforth unbolted the door, opened it to reveal a face he recognized but couldn't immediately place. Middle-aged woman, respectable cloak, the kind of stern expression that came from years of managing households or businesses or both. "We're not open yet," he said, the standard deflection. "I don't want a drink." Her voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone used to being obeyed. "I need goat's milk." "For a potion." "Augusta Longbottom said you might have some to spare." Augusta again. Aberforth kept his face neutral, but his mind was already working through implications. 2 visitors in 12 hours. both dropping Augusta's name like a password. Either the old witch was getting careless, or she was building something. A network, a system, a web of connections that could move people and information when the official channels became too dangerous. Knowing Augusta, probably the latter. Might have some, Aberforth conceded. He stepped back, allowing her entry. Fresh this morning, 3 sickles for a bottle. Highway robbery, she said, without heat, already moving toward the bar. Her eyes swept the room with the practiced assessment of someone looking for threats or opportunities. They lingered for just a moment on Ariana's portrait, then moved on, but needs must. Aberforth fetched a bottle from the back. Clean glass, sealed with wax. The milk still warm from the morning's collection. The woman placed 4 sickles on the bar, one more than asked. For your discretion, she said simply. Don't need payment for discretion, Aberforth replied, but he took the coins anyway. Refusing would raise more questions than accepting. Augusta keeping well as can be expected. The woman tucked the bottle into her bag with care. These are difficult times for those of us who remember when the ministry served the people, not the other way around. It was a test, Aberforth realized, a careful probe to see where his loyalties lay, or if he had any loyalties left to declare. He chose his words with equal care. The ministry's never served anyone but itself, just more honest about it these days. She nodded slowly, something like approval flickering across her features. Augusta said, "You were a realist. We need more of those. Too many idealists getting themselves killed for grand principles. Like Albus, Aberforth thought, but didn't say. Instead, he grunted non-committally and began wiping down the already clean bar. The woman moved toward the door, then paused. If you hear of anyone needing alternative accommodations, people who might benefit from Augusta's hospitality, she's always willing to entertain guests, provided they arrive through the proper channels." "Don't know what you mean," Aberforth said flatly. "Of course not." Her smile was thin as winter sunlight. "But if you did, she'd want you to know the side door is always open, the one by the rose garden, warded, but friends know the word. Perseverance." Then she was gone, leaving nothing but the faint scent of lavender and the certain knowledge that Aberforth's pub had just become a way station in whatever Augusta was building. He should feel angry about that, should resent being conscripted into someone else's resistance without his explicit consent. But mostly, what he felt was tired, and something dangerously close to relief. At least now he knew he wasn't alone in this particular madness. The morning stretched on. Aberforth went through the motions of opening, unlocking the front door properly, lighting lamps that did little to dispel the gloom, setting out glasses that probably wouldn't be used. The fog outside began to lift, revealing Hogsmeade in all its shabby glory. A few villagers passed by, hurrying about their business with the hunched shoulders of people trying to be invisible. Around mid-morning, the second visitor arrived. This one he recognized immediately. Mundungus Fletcher, smelling of cabbage and schemes, his patchy coat held together by optimism and poor stitching. Dung had been a fixture of the Hogshead for years, drawn by cheap drinks and the certainty that Aberforth wouldn't report his various enterprises to anyone who cared. "Mornin', Aberforth," Dung wheezed, sliding onto a bar stool with the boneless ease of the professionally dissolute. "Bit of fire whiskey to start the day, right?" "Start it yourself," Aberforth replied, but he was already reaching for the bottle, The cheap stuff, the kind that stripped paint and inhibitions in equal measure. 2 sickles. Put it on my tab. You don't have a tab. Then start me one. Dung's grin revealed teeth in various states of decay and absence, as a favour to an old friend. We're not friends, Aberforth said, pouring the drink anyway. He'd get his money eventually. Dung always paid up, even if it took months, and came in the form of stolen goods or dubious information. Dung downed the whiskey in one practiced swallow, then leaned forward conspiratorially. Heard something interesting last night, up at the castle. Aberforth continued wiping glasses, his expression unchanged. Don't care about castle gossip. Not gossip. Facts. Dung tapped his nose, a gesture that would have been knowing if it wasn't undermined by a truly spectacular burst of capillaries. The Carrows. They're looking for someone. A student, what went missing 2 days ago. Pure blood, connected to old families. They're very interested in finding this particular person. The glass in Aberforth's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second. Upstairs, the boy was hopefully smart enough to stay silent, stay hidden. Like I said, don't care. Course not. Dung's eyes were sharp despite the drink, despite the affected stupidity. Just thought you'd want to know they're searching Hogsmeade today. Being very thorough, they are. Checking every shop, every house, every pub. Aberforth set down the glass with deliberate care. They're welcome to check here. Got nothing to hide, but goats and regrets. Sure. Dung stood, swaying slightly. Still, if someone was to have something they didn't want found, might be a good morning for a long walk. Taking the goats out for air, maybe. That path behind the pub. The one what leads up toward the hills. Good for goats, that path. Private-like. He shuffled toward the door, then paused. Your brother, he said, the humour dropping from his voice like a mask. He was a right piece of work, wasn't he? All his plans and secrets. But he helped people when it mattered, in his own twisted way. Aberforth's jaw tightened. Albus helped himself. Everyone else was just collateral. Maybe, Dung shrugged. But collateral. What survived is still survival in it. Something to think about. Then he was gone, trailing the scent of cabbage and leaving behind a warning that couldn't be ignored. Aberforth stood frozen for a long moment, mind racing through options. The Carrows searching Hogsmeade meant Death Eaters, meant thorough inspections, meant the kind of attention that could get the boy upstairs killed and Aberforth arrested, or worse. He could hide the boy. There were spaces in the pub that even thorough searchers might miss. But that was a gamble with stakes too high to risk. Or he could take Dung's suggestion. The path behind the pub did lead into the hills, into terrain that was difficult to navigate and easy to disappear into. The goats needed exercise anyway. If someone happened to accompany him on that walk, well, that was just coincidence. He made the decision with the speed of long practice. We're closed, he called toward the ceiling, not quite shouting. Going out with the goats. Lock the door behind you if you're leaving. A moment later, a soft creak from above. The boy understood. Good. Aberforth gathered the goats with quick efficiency, ignoring Matilda's protests about the irregular schedule. He grabbed his heaviest cloak, the one with pockets deep enough for supplies, and a walking stick that had seen him through 40 years of Hogsmeade winters. The boy appeared on the stairs as Aberforth was fastening his cloak. He looked better than last night. Cleaner, at least, and some of the desperate edge had softened. but fear still lived in his eyes, the kind that had learned to be a permanent resident. "There's a path out back," Aberforth said without preamble. "Follow it for 2 miles, maybe 3. You'll come to a cave. Nothing fancy, but it's dry. Stay there until dark, then head northwest. You'll hit a village eventually. Small place, mostly muggles. Find the postmaster's house, the one with blue shutters. Tell them Aberforth sent you. They'll know what to do." The boy nodded, swallowing hard. "And you?" "I'm taking the goats for a walk." Aberforth opened the back door, revealing the fog-shrouded path beyond. "Anyone asks, that's all I've done. Understand?" "Yes, thank you. Save it." Aberforth cut him off. "Just move. Quickly." They moved together into the fog, an old man and his goats, and a frightened boy who had learned too young that safety was an illusion and kindness was measured in stolen moments between one danger and the next. The path climbed steadily, leaving Hogsmeade behind. The fog swallowed them whole, which was a mercy. Matilda led the way with the confidence of a creature who knew these hills better than most wizards knew their own wands. Bess and old Thomas followed, their bells muffled by the thick air. The boy stayed close, but silent, understanding instinctively that this was not a time for questions or gratitude. Aberforth appreciated that. He'd never had patience for excessive talking, even in the best of times, and these were decidedly not the best of times. After half an hour, they reached a fork in the path. Aberforth pointed left with his walking stick. "That way. Remember, northwest after dark. Tell them Perseverance if they ask for a password." The boy stared at him. "You're giving me Augusta's password?" "She'd give it to you herself if she was here." Aberforth turned away, gathering his goats. "Now go. And don't come back to Hogsmeade. There's nothing here worth dying for." "Except you," the boy said quietly. "You're here." Aberforth didn't respond. Couldn't, really. The boy disappeared into the fog, his footsteps fading to nothing. For a long moment, Aberforth stood at the fork, surrounded by his goats and his thoughts. Ariana would have liked that boy, he thought, would have seen something worth protecting in him, something worth the risk. Maybe she still did. "Come on," he told the goats. "Let's make this look convincing." They wandered the hills for another hour, long enough to establish the fiction of a simple morning walk. When Aberforth finally returned to the Hog's Head, the fog had lifted enough to reveal Death Eaters moving through Hogsmeade streets with the methodical precision of a search that expected to find something. They found nothing at the Hog's Head, just an old man, 3 goats, and a pub that smelled of regret. The Carrows moved on, disappointed and suspicious in equal measure. And in the hills beyond Hogsmeade, a boy followed a fog-shrouded path towards something that might, if luck and timing held, become safety. Aberforth poured himself a drink, the good whiskey again, and raised it toward Ariana's portrait. "One down," he murmured. "How many more before this ends?" The portrait offered no answer, but in the painted eyes, Aberforth thought he saw something that might have been approval, or might have been sorrow for all the ones he couldn't save. Both, probably. With Ariana, it had always been both. 3 days passed before the next one arrived. 3 days of false normalcy, of serving drinks to villagers who spoke in whispers and looked over their shoulders, of feeding goats and pretending that the world beyond his door wasn't fracturing further with each passing hour. Aberforth had almost convinced himself that the boy's escape had been a singular event, a moment of weakness he wouldn't repeat. Then the girl appeared. She came during the dinner hour, that brief window between afternoon and evening when the pub held its breath before the night's uncertain clientele arrived. Aberforth was restocking shelves when the door opened, admitting a gust of February wind and a figure so slight she might have been mistaken for a child. But she wasn't a child. 17, maybe 18, with the kind of face that would be pretty if it wasn't currently carved hollow by hunger and exhaustion. Her cloak was good quality, had been anyway, before mud and travel had reduced it to barely more than rags. Her hair, a mousy brown, hung in tangles around her shoulders, but it was her eyes that caught Aberforth's attention, wide, dark, and holding the particular glassiness of someone who had cried so much they'd run out of tears. She stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, one hand gripping the frame as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. "We're not," Aberforth began, then stopped, because he could see it now, the way her other hand clutched something beneath her cloak, the way her breathing came too fast and shallow, the way she looked at him with the desperate hope of someone who had exhausted every other option. "Please," she whispered. The word barely made it across the space between them. "Please, they said you might—" She didn't finish. Her legs gave out, folding beneath her like paper in water. Aberforth moved faster than he had in years, catching her before she hit the floor. She weighed nothing, less than nothing, all sharp angles and fragile bones. A bundle fell from beneath her cloak. Papers, he saw, official-looking documents with the ministry seal. He didn't read them, didn't need to. The seal told him everything. "Right," he muttered, half carrying her to the nearest chair. "Let's get you sorted." She tried to speak, but he waved her silent. "Later. Food first, then talking." In the kitchen, such as it was, mostly a corner with a stove and a few pots that had seen better decades, Aberforth assembled what passed for a meal. Bread, slightly stale. Cheese that was mostly edible. Soup from yesterday that had improved with age, as soup sometimes did. He heated it with more care than he'd admit to, adding herbs from the garden and a splash of something that might have been wine or might have been vinegar. Hard to tell with his supplies. When he returned, the girl was exactly where he'd left her, sitting rigid in the chair as if afraid that relaxing would make her shatter completely. Her eyes tracked his movements with the wariness of prey watching a predator, unable to determine if it meant harm or help. "Eat," Aberforth commanded, setting the bowl in front of her. "Slowly. You bolt it down. You'll just bring it back up." She stared at the soup like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her hand shook when she picked up the spoon, badly enough that half the first mouthful spilled back into the bowl. But she persevered, taking tiny, careful sips that gradually became something closer to actual eating. Aberforth watched from behind the bar, pretending to inventory bottles while keeping her in his peripheral vision. She ate like someone who had forgotten what food tasted like, mechanical and joyless. But she ate, which was what mattered. When the bowl was half empty, she finally spoke. "Thank you." Her voice was stronger now, though still threadbare. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I just don't." Aberforth cut her off. "Apologies waste time. You're here. You're eating. That's enough for now." She nodded, returning her attention to the soup. But her eyes kept darting to the documents she'd dropped, now sitting on the table between them like an accusation. Aberforth gave her another few minutes, then crossed to the table and picked up the papers. Ministry letterhead, official stamps, the kind of bureaucratic language that turned cruelty into policy. Muggle-born registration commission, failure to comply, wanted for questioning, and her name, Eleanor Wenlock, age 17, last known address, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He set the papers down carefully. How long have you been running? 2 weeks. The words came out flat, drained of emotion. Maybe 3. Time gets confused. Where are your family? Gone. She said it the way you'd say dead, but without wanting to use the word. They took them first. For questioning, that's what they called it. Questioning. Her laugh was sharp enough to cut. I was at Hogwarts when it happened. A friend sent word. Told me not to come home. Smart friend. She's dead now. Eleanor's hands had stopped shaking, but only because they'd gone completely still, frozen around the spoon. The Carrows didn't like her telling people the truth about what they were doing, so they made an example. Aberforth felt something old and familiar stir in his chest. Rage, yes, but underneath it, something colder and more dangerous. The Carrows. He'd heard the name, of course. Everyone had. Amicus and Electo, Death Eaters, given free rein at Hogwarts, turning the school into their personal proving ground for cruelty. Albus would have been appalled. Then again, Albus had left them this mess, so his appallment didn't count for much. You can't stay here, Aberforth said, more gently than he'd intended. It's not safe. They search the village. Not often, but enough. I know. Eleanor set down the spoon, folded her hands in her lap with careful precision. I wasn't planning to stay. I needed somewhere to rest. Just for a few hours. Then I'll go. Go where? She looked at him with those 2 wide eyes. Does it matter? It shouldn't. Shouldn't matter at all. She was just another refugee in a war that was producing them by the dozen. Another casualty of Voldemort's vision for magical Britain. There were underground networks, smuggling routes, safe houses scattered across the countryside. Someone else could help her. Someone else could take the risk. But Aberforth looked at her hollow face and saw Ariana at 14, terrified and powerless, trapped by circumstances she'd never asked for and couldn't control. Saw the way Eleanor held herself together through sheer force of will, the same way Ariana had before the will finally broke and took everything else with it. Finish your soup, he said roughly. Then we'll talk about what comes next. Eleanor's eyes filled, not with tears. She'd been honest about running out of those, but with something that might have been hope if Hope hadn't learned to be so careful. You'll help me. I'll consider it. Big difference. But they both knew he'd already decided. The decision had been made the moment he'd caught her before she fell, maybe even before that, when he'd seen her standing in his doorway, looking for a kindness the world had stopped offering. While Eleanor finished her meal, Aberforth moved through the pub with purposeful efficiency. He checked the locks on the doors, examined the wards he'd placed on the windows. Subtle things, easy to miss, but they'd give warning if Death Eaters came calling. He fed the goats, who greeted him with their usual mixture of enthusiasm and reproach. Don't start, he told Matilda, who was looking particularly judgmental. I know what I'm doing. Matilda's expression suggested otherwise, but goats were like that. Always opinions, never solutions. When he returned to the main room, Eleanor had moved from the table to stand before Ariana's portrait. She was studying it with the focused intensity of someone who understood that art wasn't just decoration, but memory made visible. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said softly. "Who was she?" "My sister." The words came out before Aberforth could stop them, rough with decades of grief that had never quite learned to settle. "Was. A long time ago." He didn't elaborate, didn't trust himself to. "Come away from there. We need to make plans." Eleanor turned, and in the lamplight, he could see her more clearly now, see past the exhaustion and fear to the person underneath. There was steel there, he realized, battered and bent, but not yet broken. She'd survived 2 weeks on the run with Death Eaters hunting her. That took more than luck. "I have some money," she said, producing a small pouch from her pocket. "Not much, but it's something. I can pay for." "Put that away." Aberforth waved it off impatiently. "You'll need it wherever you end up." "Then what do I owe you?" "Nothing. Everything. Does it matter?" He moved behind the bar, thinking. The question is where to send you. London's out. Too many patrols. Too many informants. The countryside's better, but you need connections. People who'll hide you even when it's dangerous. "I don't have connections. Everyone I knew." She trailed off, the sentence ending where too many sentences ended these days, in absence and silence. Aberforth drummed his fingers on the bar, a habit from when he'd been young enough to have nervous energy to spare. Options spun through his mind, each one carrying its own weight of risk. Augusta Longbottom's network could hide her, probably, but he'd already sent one refugee that direction. Drawing too much attention to any single safe house was how people got caught. There were others, though. Had to be. The Order of the Phoenix, what was left of it. Resistance cells scattered throughout Britain. People who remembered when Voldemort had risen the first time and had decided they wouldn't let it happen again without a fight. "There's a woman," he said slowly, the plan forming as he spoke. "Lives north of here, in a village so small it doesn't have a name. Runs a bakery, publishes a newsletter on the side. Nothing dangerous, just recipes and local gossip. Except every third edition, if you know how to read it, there are messages, codes, information about safe routes and safe people." Eleanor's expression sharpened with interest. "How do I find her?" "You don't." "I do." Aberforth reached under the bar, pulling out a piece of parchment and a quill that had seen better years. He wrote quickly, his handwriting cramped and angular. "This is for her. Don't open it. Don't lose it. And don't use your real name when you meet her." "What should I use?" "I don't care. Make something up. Something common, forgettable." He sealed the letter with a tap of his wand, watching the wax form into a shape that wasn't quite a seal, but would tell the woman what she needed to know. "You'll leave tomorrow, before dawn. There's a path through the hills. The Carrows patrol the hills. They patrol the main paths. This one's different. Old. Most people have forgotten it exists." He pulled out a second piece of parchment, sketching a rough map. "Follow this exactly. No shortcuts, no matter how tempting. The old paths have protections, wards that were set when Hogwarts was founded. They won't stop Death Eaters forever, but they'll slow them down, confuse them, buy you time." Eleanor took the map, studying it with the concentration it deserved. "And if I get caught, then you burn these." Aberforth indicated both the letter and the map. "Immediately. Don't try to save them. Don't try to bargain. Just destroy them and pray the Death Eaters are feeling merciful." They won't be. No, Aberforth agreed. They won't. The weight of that truth settled between them, heavy as stone. Eleanor folded the map carefully, tucked it and the letter into her cloak. Her hands were steadier now, purpose giving them strength that food alone couldn't provide. Why? She asked suddenly. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. Don't owe me anything. Aberforth looked at her, then passed her to where Ariana's portrait hung in shadow. In his mind, he could see his sister at 14, could see the fear in her eyes, the desperate need for someone to promise that the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed, that safety existed somewhere beyond the next disaster. He'd failed Ariana, failed her catastrophically, in ways that still woke him in the darkest hours of night. But Eleanor wasn't Ariana, and this wasn't then. And maybe, just maybe, he could do better this time. Someone has to, he said finally. Might as well be me. It wasn't a good answer, wasn't even particularly true. But it was all he had, and from the way Eleanor's expression shifted, softening, accepting, it was enough. Thank you, she said, and this time when she said it, Aberforth didn't tell her to save it. He showed her to the room upstairs, the same one the boy had used 3 days ago. It wasn't much, a narrow bed, a table, a window that looked out onto Hogsmeade's crooked streets, but it was warm and private, and for tonight at least, safe. Lock the door, he told her. Don't open it for anyone but me. And try to sleep. You'll need your strength. She nodded, already moving toward the bed, with a single-minded focus of exhaustion, finally allowed to claim its due. Aberforth left her there, descended the stairs, and returned to the empty pub below. The fire had burned low again. He rebuilt it, laying wood with the same care he'd used for Eleanor's soup, creating something that would burn steady through the night. The goats were settled, the doors were locked, the wards were holding. Everything was as secure as it could be in a world where security was a polite fiction. Aberforth poured himself a drink and carried it to the chair nearest Ariana's portrait. He sat heavily, feeling every one of his years, every choice that had led him to this moment. A pub in Hogsmeade, a girl upstairs running from Death Eaters, a brother dead in a tomb by the lake. I know what you're thinking, he told the portrait, that I'm getting soft, that this is how people get killed, caring too much, helping too many. Ariana, painted and silent, seemed to suggest that maybe caring too much was better than not caring at all. Easy for you to say, Aberforth muttered, but he was smiling, just a little, the way he only smiled when he was alone with memories and firelight and the stubborn belief that sometimes, in small ways, the world could still be made slightly less terrible. Outside, Hogsmeade settled into night. Inside the hogshead, an old man kept watch over his small rebellion, wondering how many more would come seeking help, and how long he could keep providing it before the war came knocking on his door with demands he couldn't refuse. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, he'd gotten one more person to safety. Tonight, that was enough. In the shadows, Ariana's portrait seemed to glow with something like warmth, and Aberforth raised his glass to her in silent salute. For you, girl, he whispered. Still always for you. The fire crackled its agreement, and the night kept its secrets, and somewhere in the hills north of Hogsmeade, a path waited to carry one more refugee toward the possibility of survival. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a phoenix that materialized in a burst of flame and vanished just as quickly. leaving behind only a smoking envelope and the lingering scent of ash and cinnamon. Aberforth stared at it for a full minute before picking it up. He recognized the phoenix, of course. Fawkes, Albus's bird, or what remained of the bond after Albus's death. The creature had been spotted around Hogwarts occasionally, a ghost of loyalty that didn't quite know how to let go. That it had come here, to the Hog's Head, meant someone at the castle had convinced it to carry a message. Someone who knew the phoenix would obey. Someone with access to Albus's portrait, probably. Aberforth turned the envelope over in his weathered hands. No address, no seal, just his name and handwriting he didn't recognize. Neat, controlled. The kind of script taught to young witches and wizards who took their studies seriously. He should burn it, should toss it in the fire without reading it, and go back to his morning routine of feeding goats and avoiding entanglements. But his fingers were already breaking the seal, unfolding the parchment, and he'd never been as good at self-preservation as he pretended. The message was brief. Mr. Dumbledore, your brother's portrait has requested I write to you. He says there are students in need of help. Immediate help. The Carrows are tightening their control, and some of us are struggling. We've reformed what we can of Dumbledore's army. We're using the Room of Requirement as a sanctuary, but we need supplies, food, medicine, blankets, basic things that the castle can't provide without raising questions. Your brother seems to think you might be willing to help. I'm not sure why he believes this, or why I'm trusting his judgment, but I'm running out of options, and pride is a luxury none of us can afford anymore. If you're willing, there's a way to reach us. Your brother will explain if you ask. If you're not willing, burn this letter and forget you received it. Neville Longbottom. Aberforth read it twice, then a third time, each reading stoking the anger that had been his constant companion since Albus's death. Of course, Albus had found a way to meddle even from beyond the grave. Couldn't leave well enough alone. Couldn't just let Aberforth live his quiet life of calculated isolation. Had to reach out through portraits and phoenixes and earnest young men named Longbottom. Augusta's grandson, no doubt, carrying on the family tradition of stubborn heroism. He should burn it and pour himself a drink and spend the day pretending he'd never read about students hiding in the Room of Requirement, never learned that children were fighting wars that adults had started and abandoned. Instead, he found himself climbing the stairs to the private room above the pub, the one he rarely entered, where personal things lived in dust and shadow, the room where he'd stored Albus's few possessions after refusing to attend the funeral, a handful of books, some correspondence, and a portrait that Aberforth had accepted only because destroying it felt too much like murder. The portrait hung on the far wall, covered by a sheet that had once been white. Aberforth stood before it, the letter crumpled in his fist, rage and grief and something more complicated churning in his chest. "I know you're awake," he said flatly. "Don't bother pretending otherwise." The sheet rustled slightly. Then, in a voice that carried all of Albus's infuriating gentleness, "Hello, Aberforth." Aberforth yanked the sheet down with more force than necessary. The portrait smiled at him, that same warm, knowing smile that had once charmed ministers and monsters alike, that had covered up so many secrets and so much manipulation. "You have some nerve," Aberforth growled, "sending me letters. recruiting me for your causes. You're dead, Albus. Dead. You don't get to make demands anymore. I'm not making demands. The portrait's eyes, painted, lifeless, but still somehow managing to convey that particular mixture of wisdom and sorrow that had been Albus's trademark, regarded him calmly. I'm asking. There's a difference. Is there? Aberforth threw the letter at the portrait. It passed through the canvas harmlessly, but the gesture felt necessary. You always were good at asking in ways that made refusing seem like cruelty, like moral failure. The students are suffering, Aberforth. The students are always suffering. That's what happens when you start wars and leave other people to finish them. The words tore out of him, decades of accumulated bitterness finally finding a target. You knew this was coming. You knew Voldemort would take the school, would put Death Eaters in charge of children, and you did nothing to stop it. Nothing except die dramatically and leave me to clean up the mess. The portrait was quiet for a moment. When Albus spoke again, his voice carried less certainty, more weight. You're right. Aberforth blinked. What? You're right. I made choices that seemed necessary at the time, but their consequences. The portrait's gaze drifted to something beyond the frame. I see it more clearly now. The cost of my grand plans, the people I failed in pursuit of the greater good. Don't. Aberforth's voice came out rough. Don't do that. Don't try to make this about regret and redemption. You don't get those. You're paint and canvas, a memory. You don't get to grow or change or suddenly develop a conscience. Perhaps not. Albus's attention returned to him. But you do, Aberforth. You have choices I no longer possess. The ability to help or to turn away, to repeat my mistakes or to do better. I am doing better. I'm staying out of it, not playing puppet master with other people's lives. You sent the Longbottom boy to safety 3 days ago. And the girl, Eleanor Wenlock, she made it to the baker in the north. The network is functioning because of you. Aberforth felt something cold slide down his spine. How do you know about that? Portraits talk, brother. We have our own networks, our own ways of learning things. The smile returned, tinged with sadness. I'm proud of you. What you're doing. I don't want your pride. The words came out savage. I don't want anything from you. You forfeited that right years ago when you chose your greater good over our family, over Ariana. The name hung between them like a ghost. In the portrait, Albus flinched. An artificial response, probably, programmed into the paint by whatever magic animated these things, but it looked real enough to hurt. I think about her every day, Albus said quietly, about what I could have done differently, should have done. Thinking doesn't help the dead. No, but it might help the living. The portrait leaned forward slightly, as much as the two-dimensional plane would allow. The students at Hogwarts are suffering under the Carrow's rule. Torture as punishment, fear as pedagogy. They're children, Aberforth, being broken systematically by people who enjoy the breaking. And what am I supposed to do about it? What you're already doing. Help them, provide sanctuary. But also, Albus hesitated, a rare thing for him. There's a passage, from here, from your pub, that leads directly into the room of requirement. Ariana's portrait is the key. Aberforth went very still. What? The portrait downstairs, of Ariana. It's not just a painting, it's a passageway. I created it years ago when I was still headmaster. A secret route between Hogsmeade and Hogwarts for emergencies. The portrait's expression was pleading now. The students could use it to escape when the Carrows become too dangerous. You could use it to send supplies. It's not much, but it's something. It's a way to help without exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. Aberforth's mind was racing. A passage through Ariana's portrait. A way into Hogwarts. He thought of the students Neville had written about, hiding in the room of requirement, like refugees in their own school. Thought of Eleanor and the boy and all the others who would come seeking help, seeking anything that looked like hope. You used her, he said, his voice deadly quiet. You used Ariana, turned her into a tool. Even in death, you couldn't let her just be. I honored her, Albus countered. Made her portrait a guardian, a protector. She would have wanted. Don't tell me what she would have wanted. The shout echoed in the small room. You never knew what she wanted. None of us did, because we were too busy arguing about how to keep her safe, how to manage her, how to hide her away from the world. The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving behind exhaustion and an ache that had lived in his bones for over a century. He sat heavily on the room's single chair, suddenly feeling every year of his long life. I miss her, he said quietly. Every day, I miss her. And you want me to use her portrait, her memory, to fight your war. Not my war, everyone's war. Albus's voice was gentle. But I understand if you refuse. I have no right to ask this of you. No right to ask anything. They sat in silence, the living man and the painted ghost, separated by death and decades of accumulated hurt. Outside, Hogsmeade went about its business. Inside the Hogshead, goats bleated their usual complaints. The world continued, indifferent to old wounds and older regrets. Finally, Aberforth spoke. The passage. How does it work? Relief flooded the portrait's features. You'll need to speak to Ariana's portrait directly. Ask her to help. She'll understand. The magic I wove into her painting responds to need, to genuine requests for aid. And if Death Eaters discover it, they won't. The passage only opens from this side, and only for those with pure intent. It's keyed to protection, not harm. Albus paused. I did think of that much, at least. You thought of everything except the consequences. But there was less venom in the words now, just tired acceptance. I'll do it. Not for you, not for your legacy or your plans, for the students, for Ariana's memory, properly honored. That's all I could hope for. Aberforth stood, moving toward the door, then stopped, looking back at the portrait one final time. Did you ever love us? Really love us? Or were we just pieces on your chessboard to be sacrificed when necessary? The portrait's eyes held more sorrow than Aberforth had ever seen in the living Albus. I loved you both more than anything in this world. That's why I failed you so spectacularly. I thought love meant keeping you safe, even if safety meant distance, even if it meant losing you to achieve some greater purpose. You were wrong. Yes, I was wrong about many things. A pause. But not about you, Aberforth. You are twice the man I ever was. Kinder, braver in the ways that matter. Save the flattery for your other admirers. But Aberforth didn't sound angry anymore, just tired. I'll help the students. But this doesn't mean forgiveness, doesn't mean we're reconciled. I know. The portrait smiled sadly. But perhaps in time, it means you've forgiven yourself. That's what Ariana would have wanted. Aberforth left without responding, pulling the sheet back over the portrait as he went. Let Albus sit in darkness, alone with his painted thoughts and his impossible regrets. Downstairs, the pub was empty except for Ariana's portrait. Aberforth stood before it, studying the sister he'd lost so long ago. She looked peaceful in the painting, younger than she'd been at the end, with light in her eyes that the real Ariana had lost years before her death. "I need your help," he said softly, feeling foolish talking to paint. "There are students at Hogwarts, children who need sanctuary. Albus says you can provide a passage, a way for them to reach safety." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so subtly he almost missed it, the painted Ariana smiled. Just a small thing, a gentle curve of lips that suggested understanding, acceptance, readiness. The portrait shimmered slightly, and where solid wall had been, a dark passage opened, narrow, winding, leading into shadow and possibility. Aberforth stared at it, this impossible gift from a dead girl who had never gotten to help anyone in life but could, apparently, protect them in death. "Thank you," he whispered. Then, louder, "I'll send word to the students. Let them know they have a way out when they need it." The passage remained open for another moment, then slowly sealed itself, the wall returning as if it had never been breached. But Ariana's smile lingered in the portrait, warmer than before, and Aberforth felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first small step toward it. He had work to do, a letter to write, supplies to gather, students to save. It wasn't much, measured against the scope of the war, but it was what he could offer, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. In the room upstairs, beneath a dusty sheet, Albus's portrait smiled to itself. Not triumph. He'd learned finally that triumph was a hollow thing, but hope, perhaps. Hope that his brother might find peace, might discover that helping others could heal even the oldest wounds. And in the space between portraits, in the magic that connected them across canvas and consequence, Ariana's spirit rested easier, knowing that even in death, she could still protect the people her brothers loved. The goats bleated, the fire crackled, and in the Hogs Head Inn, an old man began planning his small rebellion, one refugee at a time. The reply came faster than Aberforth expected, a single line scrawled on parchment that arrived with the evening post, nestled between notices for overdue tabs and advertisements for dubious potions. When? Just that. One word, but it carried the weight of desperation and hope in equal measure. Neville Longbottom, it seemed, was a young man who understood the value of brevity when lives hung in the balance. Aberforth sat at the bar, the letter spread before him, a glass of whiskey forgotten at his elbow. The pub was empty, truly empty this time, not the false emptiness that hid fugitives upstairs or secrets in back rooms. Just him and the silence, and a decision that felt heavier than it should. Activating the passage meant commitment, meant accepting that the Hog's Head was no longer just a pub, but a way station, a sanctuary, a target. Once students started using Ariana's portrait to escape the Carrow's cruelty, there would be no going back to comfortable isolation. He'd be his brother's keeper after all, in the most literal sense. Albus's students, Albus's war, Albus's impossible faith that one old man with goats and regrets could make a difference. "Damn you, Albus," he muttered. But there was less venom in it than there should have been. He wrote his response with the same economy Neville had shown. "Tonight, midnight. Come alone first. We'll talk." The letter vanished in a flash of flame. Fawkes again, answering some call that transcended death and duty. Aberforth watched the phoenix disappear and wondered if birds understood irony, because there was something darkly appropriate about Albus's familiar helping to undermine everything Voldemort was building. The hours until midnight crawled by with the stubborn slowness of time that knew it was being watched. Aberforth went through the motions of closing the pub, washing glasses that were already clean, sweeping floors that held no new dirt, feeding goats who looked at him with expressions that suggested they knew he was stalling. "Mind your business," he told Matilda, who was being particularly judgmental. "I'm thinking," Matilda bleated skeptically. "Fine. I'm procrastinating. Same thing." But eventually, inevitably, the clock hands crept toward midnight, and Aberforth found himself standing before Ariana's portrait with a racing heart he refused to acknowledge. The pub was dark, except for a single lamp, its light casting long shadows that made the portrait seem almost alive. "Right then," he said to the painted face, "let's see if you remember how to do this." He raised his wand, tapped the frame twice, a rhythm that felt like memory, like something he'd known once and forgotten, and spoke the words that tasted of old magic and older grief. "Ariana, there are children who need help. Will you let them through?" The portrait shimmered. Ariana's painted eyes, so like their mother's, he realized with a pang, seemed to focus on him directly. Then slowly, deliberately, she nodded. The wall behind the portrait dissolved like morning mist, revealing the passage beyond. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and stretched into darkness that felt both comforting and ominous. The walls were rough stone, ancient and worn smooth by time rather than use. Faint light emanated from somewhere deep within, a silvery glow that suggested magic woven into the very fabric of the passage. Aberforth stared at it, this impossible gift from a dead girl and a brother he couldn't forgive. Somewhere at the other end was Hogwarts, the castle where Ariana had never been a student, where she'd never gotten to discover her house or learn proper magic, or make friends who understood what it meant to be young and frightened and powerful all at once. "You would have loved it there," he told the portrait softly. "Would have been Hufflepuff, probably, loyal to the core, you were. Or Gryffindor, maybe, brave enough when it mattered." The portrait's smile suggested she appreciated the thought, even if painted lips couldn't voice agreement. Footsteps sounded from within the passage, confident strides that echoed against stone. Aberforth's hand moved to his wand instinctively, then relaxed as a figure emerged into the lamplight. Neville Longbottom looked nothing like his grandmother's description. Augusta had painted a picture of a nervous boy, clumsy and uncertain, always trailing behind braver friends. The young man who stepped out of the passage carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to lead because no one else would. He was stockier than Aberforth expected, built solid like a beater, with a round face that would have been pleasant in peacetime, but now carried the sharp edges of hunger and sleepless nights. A bruise darkened his left cheek, fresh enough to still be purple. His robes were torn at the shoulder, mended with hasty stitches that spoke of limited supplies and even more limited time. But his eyes, those were what caught Aberforth's attention, brown and steady and holding the particular sadness of someone who'd seen too much too young but refused to let it break him. Mr. Dumbledore, Neville said, extending a hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Aberforth shook it, noting the calluses and the strength in the grip. Just Aberforth. And you're Augusta's grandson. Yes, sir. A hint of warmth entered Neville's expression. She speaks highly of you. Your gran always was a terrible judge of character. But Aberforth gestured to the bar. Sit. Tell me what's happening up at the castle. Neville took a stool, wincing slightly as he settled onto it. Broken ribs, Aberforth diagnosed with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen his share of injuries. Recent, probably from this week. The Carrows, Neville began, his voice level despite the anger simmering beneath. They're not just teaching dark arts anymore. They're practicing it, on students. Amicus uses the Cruciatus curse as punishment for wrong answers. Alecto. He paused, jaw tightening. Alecto has opinions about blood purity that she's very enthusiastic about sharing. With her wand. Aberforth poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking, pushed one across the bar. How many students in the room of requirement? Started with 12. We're up to 20 now. Could be more. Some are too scared to leave the dormitories, even when the Carrows are hunting them. Neville took a sip, grimaced. We're managing. The room provides beds, basic shelter, but food is getting scarce. The house elves try to help when they can, but the Carrows watch them closely. And Snape? The name tasted bitter. What's the headmaster doing while Death Eaters torture children? Nothing. The word carried more condemnation than a paragraph could. He stays in his office, makes appearances at meals, delivers speeches about discipline and the new order. But he doesn't stop the Carrows, doesn't even try. Aberforth filed that information away, uncertain what to make of it. Snape had killed Albus, on Albus's orders, supposedly, though Aberforth had his doubts about the nobility of that particular narrative. Either way, the man was headmaster of Hogwarts and doing nothing while students suffered. Typical. Everyone in this war was either a martyr or a coward, and sometimes it was impossible to tell which was which. I can send supplies, Aberforth said. Food, medicine, blankets, basic necessities. But it'll need to be regular, once a week, maybe more. That would be... Neville's voice caught. That would be everything. We've been rationing for weeks. Some of the younger ones are getting sick from the cold and the hunger combined. Make me a list. Be specific. And tell me about the students. Ages, any injuries or illnesses I should know about, special needs. Aberforth pulled out parchment and quill. Suddenly, all business. I need to know what I'm supplying and who I'm supplying it to. They spent the next hour going through details. 20 students, ranging from 2nd years to 7th years. Most in decent health despite everything, though a Ravenclaw 4th year had a broken arm that wasn't healing properly, and a Hufflepuff 6th year needed potions for asthma that the hospital wing refused to provide any more. They're using medical care as leverage, Neville explained, his voice tight with controlled fury. Cooperate with the Carrows, get treatment, resist, and you suffer. Bastards, Aberforth said, without heat. It was just fact, no emotion required. I can get the potions. Know an apothecary in Edinburgh who owes me a favour. Won't ask questions. You're risking a lot for us. I'm risking a pub and some peace. You're risking your lives. Aberforth met Neville's eyes directly. Don't mistake what I'm doing for bravery. It's just necessary. Someone has to. That's what Gran always says. Neville smiled slightly. Right before she does something terrifically dangerous and pretends it's just common sense. Your Gran is a menace. She'd take that as a compliment. They worked through the rest of the list in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared purpose rather than shared history. By the time they finished, Aberforth had 3 pages of notes and a much clearer picture of what he was committing to. One more thing, Neville said as he stood to leave. The passage, how many people know about it? Just you, me, and Albus's portrait. Aberforth scowled at the mention of his brother. And it stays that way for now. The fewer people who know, the safer everyone is. Agreed. Neville extended his hand again. I should get back before the Carrows notice I'm gone. They do bed checks sometimes. Randomly. Aberforth shook his hand, surprised by the reluctance he felt at seeing the young man leave. There was something solid about Neville Longbottom. Something reliable that inspired confidence despite his youth. Your parents would be proud of you, he said gruffly. What you're doing. Taking care of the others. Neville's expression flickered, grief and pride and something more complicated. You knew them. Knew of them. Frank and Alice, heroes of the First War. Aberforth cleared his throat. What the Death Eaters did to them. There aren't words. No, Neville agreed quietly. There aren't. He turned toward the passage, then paused. Aberforth, the supplies you're sending. We'll find a way to repay you. After the war, however long it takes. Don't be stupid. Just survive. That's payment enough. Neville nodded and stepped into the passage. The darkness swallowed him, footsteps echoing and then fading as he made his way back to Hogwarts, back to the room of requirement, and the students counting on him to keep them alive one more day. Aberforth watched until the passage sealed itself, the wall solidifying behind Ariana's portrait, as if it had never been breached. The portrait itself seemed pleased, a subtle shift in expression that suggested satisfaction, purpose fulfilled. You like that, don't you? Aberforth asked her. Being useful. Protecting people. The painted smile deepened slightly. Should have been able to do this in life, he continued, his voice rough with old pain. Should have been able to go to Hogwarts, learn magic properly, make friends, have adventures. All the things normal magical children get to do. Ariana's expression held no reproach, no bitterness, just acceptance and, somehow, contentment. As if protecting students from beyond death was its own kind of magic, its own kind of education. Right then, Aberforth turned away, busying himself with tidying up the notes he'd taken. Tomorrow, I'll start gathering supplies. Food first, things that keep well, travel light, then the potions, then blankets, and whatever else they need. The goats bleated from the back room, reminding him of other responsibilities. He fed them their evening ration, checked their water, made sure Matilda hadn't found some new way to create chaos. We're running a refuge now, he told them conversationally. Students escaping Death Eaters, using the pub as a way station. Completely mental, obviously, but here we are. The goats, being goats, didn't seem particularly concerned. They had food, water, and shelter. The complexities of war were human problems. Aberforth envied them that simplicity. Later, alone in his room above the pub, he pulled out a wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs. His mother, young and smiling before grief hollowed her out. His father, stern and certain in his righteousness. Albus at 17, brilliant and beautiful, and already plotting schemes that would reshape the wizarding world. And Ariana. Always Ariana, frozen at 14 in the last photograph, taken before everything fell apart. She was laughing in the picture, genuinely laughing, at some joke their mother had made. Her magic sparked around her like fireflies, uncontrolled but joyful. "I'm doing this for you," Aberforth told the photograph. "Not for Albus, not for some greater good. For you, because you never got to protect anyone in life, and maybe this is how you finally can." The photograph couldn't answer, but the Ariana in it smiled, and somewhere in the pub below, her portrait kept watch over the passage that would carry so many to safety in the months to come. Outside, Hogsmeade slept. Inside the Hogshead, an old man made lists and plans and silently declared war on everyone who thought children were acceptable casualties in their grand conflicts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And in the room of requirement at Hogwarts, Neville Longbottom told 20 frightened students that help was coming, that someone in Hogsmeade was willing to fight for them, that they weren't as alone as they'd feared. The news spread through the group like warmth through cold hands, tentative, fragile, but real. Some cried, some laughed, some just sat in stunned silence, too exhausted for any reaction at all. But they all felt it, the first small spark of hope in weeks of darkness. And in the shadows of the castle, portraits whispered the news through their networks, carrying word that Aberforth Dumbledore, grumpy, reclusive, supposedly broken Aberforth, had finally picked a side. The war wouldn't end because of one pub owner and his goats and his dead sister's portrait. But it might, just possibly, hurt a little less. The first delivery went smoothly. Too smoothly, Aberforth thought, which meant the universe was saving up trouble for later. He'd packed the supplies with meticulous care, bread wrapped in cloth to stay fresh, hard cheese that wouldn't spoil, dried fruit and nuts, 3 blankets that had seen better days but were still warm, and a carefully labelled collection of potions from his contact in Edinburgh. Everything fit into 2 canvas bags that he could carry through the passage without drawing attention. At midnight, he'd opened Ariana's portrait, made the journey to Hogwarts, his first time in the castle since Albus's funeral that he hadn't attended, and handed everything to Neville, who'd been waiting with the organised efficiency of a born quartermaster. The room of requirement had been larger than he'd expected, configured as a makeshift dormitory with beds lining the walls and a communal area in the centre. The students, those who were still awake, had stared at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief, as if a Dumbledore showing up to help was some kind of miracle. He'd left quickly, uncomfortable with their gratitude, with the weight of their hope pressing against his chest like a physical thing. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of regular deliveries, of learning names and faces, of gradually accepting that this was his life now. Pub owner by day, quartermaster for student rebels by night. 3 weeks of waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on a Thursday. Aberforth was restocking the bar, the actual bar this time, not the secret supplies he kept hidden for the room of requirement, when the pub door slammed open hard enough to rattle the bottles on the shelves. He turned, already reaching for his wand, and found himself facing 3 Death Eaters. Not the Carrows, thankfully. He'd seen their portraits around Hogwarts during his deliveries and knew them by sight. These were lower-ranking thugs, the kind Voldemort used for intimidation and enforcement. They wore the masks, the black robes, the whole theatrical costume that was meant to inspire fear. On Aberforth, it mostly inspired irritation. "We're closed," he said flatly, not moving his hand from his wand. The tallest one, built like a mountain troll and probably about as intelligent, stepped forward. "Funny, door wasn't locked." "That's because I'm doing inventory. Closed means no customers. Try again tomorrow." "We're not customers." The Death Eater's voice was muffled by the mask, but carried enough malice to be clear. "We're conducting an inspection. Ministry orders. All establishments in Hogsmeade need to be searched for irregularities." Irregularities. Aberforth let the word hang in the air, like a bad smell. "You mean people. You're looking for people. We're looking for enemies of the regime, blood traitors, Muggle-borns hiding from proper justice." The Death Eater moved further into the pub, his companions flanking him. "You won't mind if we take a look around?" "Mind?" Aberforth minded very much. Upstairs, hidden in a cupboard, were 3 weeks' worth of supply lists, evidence that would connect him directly to the resistance at Hogwarts. In the back room, mixed with legitimate goods, were potions that had no business being in a pub. And on the wall, watching everything with painted eyes, was Ariana's portrait, which might or might not hold up under scrutiny if they knew what they were looking at. But saying any of that would just confirm their suspicions. "Search away," Aberforth said, gesturing broadly, "though you'll find nothing but goats, cheap whiskey, and disappointment. Same as everyone else who comes here looking for something better." The Death Eaters spread out with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. The tall one headed for the back room. Another started up the stairs. The third, smaller, quicker, began examining the main room, running his wand over walls and furniture, checking for concealment charms or hidden compartments. Aberforth stood behind the bar, projecting an aura of bored indifference, while his mind raced through contingency plans. If they found the supply lists, he could claim he was just helping students with legitimate purchases. Nothing illegal about that. If they found the potions, he could say they were for the goats. Ludicrous. But who would bother verifying? If they found the passage number, they wouldn't. Albus had warded it too well. The magic that protected Ariana's portrait was old and subtle, designed to hide from exactly this kind of search. Unless they knew what they were looking for, unless someone had betrayed him, the passage would remain invisible. From the back room came the sound of crates being overturned, glass bottles clinking against each other. Matilda bleated indignantly, followed by the distinctive thud of a goat ramming something or someone with enthusiastic force. "Control your animals," the tall Death Eater shouted. "She doesn't like strangers," Aberforth called back. "Fair judge of character, Matilda." A crash, then cursing. Aberforth allowed himself the smallest smile. "Good girl." Upstairs, footsteps moved from room to room, the creak of drawers being opened, the rustle of papers being examined. Aberforth's hands tightened on the bar, but he kept his expression neutral, bored even. Just another day dealing with petty tyranny. The Death Eater, searching the main room, paused in front of Ariana's portrait. Aberforth's heart stopped. "Who's this?" The Death Eater gestured at the painting with his wand. "My sister." The words came out rougher than intended. Dead. Long time ago. Sad story. The tone suggested the Death Eater found it anything but. He tapped the frame with his wand, muttering detection spells under his breath. Aberforth held himself absolutely still. Ariana's portrait remained passive, just paint and canvas, giving away nothing. The wards held. The passage stayed hidden. But the Death Eater was thorough, checking the edges of the frame, the wall behind it, looking for anything out of place. "Pretty girl," he said finally, stepping back. Shame about whatever happened to her. "Yes," Aberforth agreed coldly. "It was." The Death Eater moved on, apparently satisfied. Aberforth exhaled slowly, carefully, not allowing the relief to show on his face. The search continued for another 20 minutes, 20 minutes that felt like hours, each second stretched thin with tension. They found nothing incriminating. The supply lists remained hidden in their cupboard, protected by a notice-me-not charm Aberforth had placed weeks ago. The suspicious potions were dismissed as veterinary supplies. Even Matilda's aggressive behavior was written off as just a difficult goat. Finally, the Death Eaters regrouped in the main room, clearly frustrated by their lack of findings. "You're lucky," the tall one said, pulling off his mask to reveal a scarred face and cold eyes. "We'll be watching you, Dumbledore. Your brother was a blood traitor, and those things tend to run in families." "My brother was a lot of things," Aberforth replied evenly. "But what he was or wasn't has nothing to do with me. I'm just a publican. I serve drinks and mind my own business. See that you do." The Death Eater moved toward the door, his companions following. "Next time, we won't be so polite." They left in a swirl of black robes and implied threats. Aberforth waited until their footsteps faded completely, before allowing himself to lean heavily against the bar, suddenly aware of how tense he'd been, how close things had come to disaster. In the back room, Matilda bleated triumphantly. Aberforth went to check on her, found the Death Eater's mask lying in the corner, covered in goat spit and bearing several hoof-shaped dents. "You magnificent creature," he told her, scratching behind her ears. "Remind me to give you extra feed tonight." Matilda accepted the praise as her due, already plotting her next act of rebellion. Upstairs, Aberforth retrieved the supply lists from their hiding place and set about burning them. He should have done it earlier, should never have kept written records in the first place. But some part of him had needed the organization, the structure, the tangible proof that he was helping. Stupid sentiment. Dangerous sentiment. He watched the parchment curl and blacken in the fire, committing the information to memory instead. 20 students, specific needs, regular delivery schedule. It was all there in his head now, safer than any written record. When the last ash had floated up the chimney, he poured himself a drink and carried it to stand before Ariana's portrait. "That was close," he told her quietly. "Too close." They're getting suspicious, starting to watch more carefully. The portrait's expression held concern but no fear. Ariana had never been one to back down from danger, even when she should have. "I know what you're thinking," Aberforth continued, "that we should keep going, that the students need us. And you're right, but it's getting more dangerous. For them, for me, for everyone involved." Ariana's painted eyes seemed to ask, "And when has danger ever been a good reason to stop helping people?" "Since always," Aberforth muttered. But he was already planning the next delivery, already thinking about How to be more careful, more clever, more like Albus with his schemes and contingencies. The thought made him scowl. He didn't want to be like Albus, didn't want to start thinking in terms of acceptable risks and calculated sacrifices. But maybe that was the price of resistance. Becoming the thing you'd criticized, using the same methods you'd condemned, all in service of something you told yourself was more important than principles. A knock at the back door interrupted his brooding. Not the coded pattern, just 3 sharp raps that could have been anything: a delivery, a lost customer, trouble in a different form. Aberforth approached cautiously, one drawn, and opened the door to find Augusta Longbottom standing in the alley, wrapped in a travelling cloak and looking thoroughly displeased with the world. "Going to let me in?" she demanded, more than asked. "Or shall I stand here advertising that something interesting is happening at the Hog's Head?" Aberforth stepped back, allowing her to sweep past him with the imperious grace of someone who'd been ordering people around for 70 years and had no intention of stopping. "Death Eaters just searched the place," he said without preamble. "You're taking a risk being seen here. I'm taking a risk breathing these days." Augusta removed her cloak, revealing robes that had been patched and mended, but maintained with fierce pride. "But I didn't come here to discuss the obvious dangers of being alive during a war. I came to warn you." Aberforth closed and locked the door. "About the Carrows. They're suspicious about how the students in the room of requirement are getting supplies. They know someone is helping, but haven't figured out who yet." Augusta's sharp eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "How careful have you been?" "Careful enough. The passage is warded. The deliveries are irregular. I don't follow patterns." "Good. Because they've started watching Hogsmeade more closely. Death Eaters in the village, random inspections like the one you just experienced. They're tightening the noose. Tell me something I don't know." "Very well." Augusta settled into a chair without being invited, the kind of presumption that would have annoyed Aberforth if it wasn't so typically her. "There's a spy. Someone in the Resistance or close to it, feeding information to the Death Eaters. Small things so far. Meeting locations, safe house addresses. But they're getting closer to the important secrets." Aberforth felt cold creep down his spine. "How do you know?" "Because 3 safe houses have been raided in the last 2 weeks. Houses that only a handful of people knew about." Augusta's expression was grim. "Someone is talking, either willingly or under duress, but the result is the same. The students are safe for now. The spy doesn't seem to know about the room of requirement or your involvement, but it's only a matter of time." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You need to be more careful, Aberforth. Vary your schedule. Check for surveillance charms. Don't trust anyone you don't have to. I don't trust anyone anyway." "Good. Keep it that way." Augusta stood, preparing to leave as abruptly as she'd arrived. "And if you notice anything unusual, anyone paying too much attention, asking too many questions, you contact me immediately." "How?" She pulled a small mirror from her pocket, placed it on the table. "Two-way mirror. Say my name. I'll answer if I can. Don't use it unless it's urgent." Aberforth picked up the mirror, studied his own reflection staring back at him, older than he remembered, more worn, but still recognizably himself. "You're building quite the network, Augusta." "Someone has to." The Order of the Phoenix is scattered, the ministry is corrupt, and decent people are dying because they don't have the connections to survive. Her voice carried steel underneath the matter-of-fact tone. If that means I become a conspiracy of one old witch and her grandson, so be it. Not just your grandson anymore. No. Augusta smiled slightly. Not just my grandson. There are more of us than Voldemort realizes. People who remember the last war and refuse to let history repeat itself without a fight. She swept toward the door, paused with her hand on the knob. Neville speaks highly of you. Says you're keeping them alive up there. I'm just sending supplies. You're giving them hope. That's more valuable than food. Augusta's expression softened fractionally. Your brother would be proud. My brother is dead. Death hasn't stopped him having opinions before. She opened the door, checked the alley, then slipped out into the night as silently as she'd arrived. Aberforth locked the door behind her and stood for a long moment in the darkness, holding the mirror and thinking about spies and searches and how quickly everything could fall apart. Then he returned to the main room, poured another drink, and raised it toward Ariana's portrait. To staying alive, he said quietly, and keeping others alive with us. The portrait smiled his gentle approval, and somewhere in the walls of Hogwarts, 20 students slept safely in the room of requirement, unaware of how close the darkness was creeping, how thin the margin between sanctuary and disaster had become. But for tonight, they were safe. Tomorrow could worry about itself. Spring came to Hogsmeade like a hesitant promise, snowdrops pushing through the last stubborn patches of snow, sunlight lingering a few minutes longer each evening, the kind of spring that suggested renewal was possible, even in the middle of a war. Aberforth didn't trust it. He'd been running supplies to the room of requirement for 2 months now. 2 months of midnight journeys through Ariana's portrait, of carefully rationed food and desperately needed potions, of watching Neville Longbottom transform from a nervous young man into something harder and more certain. 2 months of Death Eaters, prowling Hogsmeade, of random searches that found nothing but came closer each time, of living with the knowledge that one mistake would cost lives. The students in the room had grown from 20 to nearly 30. More kept arriving, escapees from the Carrow's cruelty, refugees from homes that were no longer safe, fighters who decided that hiding was better than surrender, but still wanted to resist. The room expanded to accommodate them all, providing beds and space and the basic necessities of survival. But it couldn't provide hope. That had to come from outside, and it was getting harder to find. Tonight's delivery was heavier than usual. Extra blankets now that more students needed them. Medical supplies for injuries that were becoming more frequent as the Carrows escalated their violence, and food enough to last a week if they rationed carefully. Aberforth had packed it all into 3 bags, cursing the weight, and is aging back in equal measure. The pub was dark and quiet as he approached Ariana's portrait. Nearly 3 in the morning, the safest time, when even Death Eaters were sleeping or drunk or distracted by whatever passed for entertainment in their circles. "Ready, girl?" he asked the portrait softly. Ariana smiled her gentle smile, and the passage opened like it always did, revealing the narrow corridor that led to Hogwarts. Aberforth shouldered the bags with a grunt and stepped inside. The journey had become familiar over the weeks. The rough stone walls, the silvery light that came from nowhere and everywhere, the slight upward slope that made his knees ache, He'd learned to walk it quickly but carefully, aware that even magical passages could betray you if you weren't paying attention. Halfway through, he heard something that made him freeze. Voices coming from the Hogwarts end. Raised voices, urgent and afraid. Aberforth dropped the bags and drew his wand, moving forward with the careful silence of someone who'd survived too long to die from carelessness. The voices grew clearer as he approached the room of requirement entrance. Multiple speakers talking over each other in tones that ranged from panic to fury. He emerged into chaos. The room of requirement looked like a battlefield. Beds were overturned, supplies scattered, and at least a dozen students were gathered in the center, surrounding something or someone that Aberforth couldn't see. Neville stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and his wand drawn, looking more dangerous than Aberforth had ever seen him. What happened? Aberforth's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Everyone turned. Several students jumped, clearly not expecting him. Neville's expression shifted from grim determination to something closer to relief. Aberforth, thank God. He gestured toward the crowd. We have a problem. The students parted reluctantly, revealing a figure huddled on the floor. A boy, maybe 16, with dark hair and a Slytherin tie hanging loose around his neck. His face was bruised, blood trickling from his nose, and he looked up at Aberforth with eyes that held equal parts fear and defiance. Found him, sneaking around outside the room, a seventh-year girl explained, her wand still trained on the boy. He was trying to get in. We think he's a spy for the Carrows. I'm not, the boy's voice cracked. I swear, I'm not. I needed help. I didn't know where else to go. Likely story, someone muttered. Slytherin showing up in the middle of the night, expecting us to believe he's suddenly on our side. I never said I was on their side. The boy tried to stand, but 3 wands immediately pointed at his chest, forcing him back down. I just want to survive. Is that so hard to believe? Aberforth studied the scene with a practiced assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading people. The boy was terrified, yes, but there was something genuine in his fear. Not the calculation of a spy caught, but the desperation of someone who'd run out of options. What's your name? Aberforth asked. The boy hesitated. Does it matter? It does, if you want me to decide whether to let them hex you or not. Marcus Flint. At Aberforth's raised eyebrow, he added quickly, I know. The family. My father's a Death Eater. My older brother too. But I'm not. I never took the mark. I don't... His voice broke. I don't want any part of this. So why now? Neville asked, his tone harder than Aberforth had ever heard. You've been at Hogwarts all year, going to classes, following the rules, keeping your head down. Why run now? Because they want me to prove myself. Marcus's hands were shaking. The Carrows. They're planning something big. They want students from good families to help, to show our loyalty. And he swallowed hard. I can't. I won't. But refusing means... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew what refusing the Carrows meant. He could be lying, the 7th-year girl said. Could be setting us up. Pretending to defect so he can report back everything he sees. I'm not. Marcus's desperation was palpable. Please, I know you have no reason to trust me. I know my family, my house. I know what it looks like. But I'm telling the truth. I just want to survive this war without becoming a monster. Silence fell over the room. Aberforth could feel the weight of it. The decades of prejudice and suspicion, the reasonable fear that had been earned through bitter experience. Slytherins couldn't be trusted. Everyone knew that. The house that had produced Voldemort, that had cheered when Muggle-borns were persecuted, that had supplied more Death Eaters than all other houses combined. Except that was the same kind of thinking that led to blood purity arguments. The same logic that said Muggle-borns were inherently inferior, that heritage determined worth, that what you were born as mattered more than what you chose to become. Aberforth had spent too long hating his brother's certainties to start embracing his own. "Let him up," he said quietly. Several students protested at once, but Neville raised a hand for silence. "Aberforth," I said, "let him up." Aberforth moved forward, extending a hand to Marcus. "You want sanctuary, you've got it. But make no mistake, you betray these students, you'll answer to me, and I'm considerably less forgiving than they are." Marcus took the offered hand, letting Aberforth pull him to his feet. Up close, he looked even younger, just a boy playing at being brave because the alternative was playing at being cruel. "Thank you," Marcus whispered. "I won't. I'll prove myself. I promise." "Don't promise. Just survive. That's all any of us can do." Aberforth turned to address the assembled students. "He stays. Anyone disagrees, take it up with me." The seventh-year girl looked mutinous, but Neville nodded slowly. "All right, but he sleeps in the open, where we can see him, and someone watches him at all times." "Fair enough," Marcus agreed quickly. "I understand. I would too." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, returning to beds and interrupted sleep with frequent backward glances at their new, unwelcome guest. Neville helped Aberforth retrieve the supply bags from the passage, and together they began organizing the delivery with the practiced efficiency of long routine. "You think I'm making a mistake?" Aberforth said. "It wasn't a question. I think you're taking a risk." Neville set down a bag of medical supplies, began sorting through potions. "But then, we've been taking risks since this started. What's one more? One more could be the one that kills you all. Could be." Neville met his eyes directly, but refusing him could have killed his soul. Sometimes the right choice and the safe choice aren't the same thing. Aberforth grunted, uncomfortable with the wisdom in someone so young. "Your Gran's been teaching you philosophy along with hexes." Gran says the two aren't that different, both about knowing when to stand firm and when to adapt. Neville glanced toward where Marcus sat alone in the corner, isolated by suspicion and his own house tie. "Besides, you're the one who taught us that protection isn't just about fighting. It's about giving people a chance to be better than their circumstances." "I never said that. You didn't have to. You show it every time you walk through that passage." Neville smiled slightly. "Actions teach louder than words," Gran always says. They finished the unpacking in comfortable silence. More students had drifted over to help now that the drama had passed. Younger ones mostly, second and third years, who probably shouldn't be in the room at all, but had nowhere else to go. They worked with the quiet competence of people who'd learned to make themselves useful, sorting food and folding blankets and organizing potions with careful hands. Aberforth watched them and felt something crack in his chest. Not breaking, but opening. These children, with their bruised faces and scared eyes and stubborn refusal to give up. They reminded him of Ariana, of course, but also of something larger, of everyone who'd ever been powerless and afraid, and decided that maybe, just maybe, they could survive if they helped each other. "The war's getting worse," Neville said quietly, breaking into his thoughts. "Rumor is something's happening, something big. People are moving, gathering. It feels like everything's building towards something." "Wars always build towards something," Aberforth replied. "Question is whether you're ready when it arrives." "Are we?" Aberforth looked around the room, at the students organizing supplies, at Marcus sitting alone with his shame and his hope, at the beds lined up against walls that would protect them for now, but might not protect them tomorrow. "No," he said honestly. "But then no one ever is." A younger student approached, a Hufflepuff third year with a scar across her forehead that hadn't been there last week. She carried one of the blankets Aberforth had brought, holding it like it was precious. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, the food, the blankets, the potions, but mostly for—" She hesitated, searching for words. "For making us feel like someone still cares what happens to us." Aberforth wanted to deflect, to say he was just moving supplies, just doing what needed doing, but he looked at her scarred face and couldn't manage the lie. "You're welcome," he said gruffly. "Now go get some sleep. You look terrible." She smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her, and hurried off to claim one of the new blankets. "You're getting soft," Neville observed, but there was warmth in his voice. "I'm getting old." Different thing. Aberforth shouldered his now empty bags. "I should go. Dawn's not far off, and I need to be back before the village wakes. Same time next week? Unless Death Eaters burn down my pub. Then it might be delayed." Neville walked him to the passage entrance. "Aberforth, when this is over, when the war ends, what will you do? Assuming I survive." Aberforth shrugged. "Go back to serving drinks and minding goats. Same as always. You'll miss this, though. Helping people. I won't miss sneaking through passages at 3 a.m, that's for damn certain." But Aberforth paused, considering. "Maybe I won't mind if people keep dropping by. Refugees, students, anyone who needs a place that doesn't ask too many questions. The pub could be that. If I wanted, I think it already is." Aberforth entered the passage without responding, but the words followed him through the darkness, echoing against stone walls that had heard too many secrets and kept them all. When he emerged in the Hogs Head, dawn was just beginning to touch the windows with pale light. The pub smelled like home, old wood and spilled drinks and goats. Ariana's portrait watched him with her gentle smile, and Aberforth stood before her for a long moment, not speaking, just being present with the memory of his sister and the choices he'd made in her name. "We're doing good work," he told her finally. "Not perfect, not without risk, but good." The portrait's smile deepened, and Aberforth felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but something closer to it than he'd felt in decades. Acceptance, maybe, of his choices, his limitations, his brother's legacy, and his own role in a war he hadn't wanted but couldn't avoid. He poured himself a drink, the good whiskey, always the good whiskey for these moments, and raised it toward the portrait. "For you, girl. Everything's still for you. But maybe," he paused, surprising himself, "maybe for me too. And for them. All those students up there who need someone to believe they're worth saving." Ariana's painted eyes seemed to say she'd known that all along, had been waiting for him to figure it out, "Don't look so smug," Aberforth muttered. But he was smiling, just a little, the way he only smiled when he was alone with ghosts and the possibility of redemption. Outside, Hogsmeade woke to spring sunshine and the illusion of normalcy. Inside the Hog's Head, an old man fed his goats and cleaned his bar and prepared for whatever the day would bring. Death Eaters or refugees or simple customers seeking simple drinks. He was ready for all of it. Because somewhere between the first frightened boy and the Slytherin seeking sanctuary, between Albus's portrait and Ariana's passage, between Augusta's network and Neville's leadership, Aberforth Dumbledore had found something he thought he'd lost a century ago. Purpose, connection, the stubborn belief that one person acting with intention and refusing to look away could make the world slightly less terrible. It wasn't much, but it was everything. And in the months to come, through the escalating war and the final battle, through the losses and the small victories, the Hog's Head would remain what it had become, a sanctuary, a way station, a place where hope could rest before continuing its journey. All because an old man had looked at his sister's portrait and decided that some things were worth fighting for, even if you'd spent a lifetime trying to avoid the fight. The goats bleated their morning demands. The fire crackled to life. And through Ariana's portrait, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the distant sounds of Hogwarts waking, students stirring, portraits gossiping, a castle remembering that even in darkness there were lights that refused to be extinguished. Aberforth Dumbledore had become one of those lights, and he discovered, much to his surprise, that he didn't mind at all. Epilogue. After the battle. The student appeared on a bright May morning, 3 days after Voldemort fell and the world stopped holding its breath. Aberforth was sweeping the pub, actually sweeping this time, not just going through motions, when the door opened and Neville Longbottom walked in, wearing the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving something you weren't sure you'd survive. "We won," Neville said simply. Aberforth set down the broom. "I heard. Whole village heard. Church bells and everything. A lot of people died. They always do." They stood in silence for a moment. Two people who'd spent months fighting a war from the shadows, now blinking in the sudden sunshine of victory and wondering what came next. "I came to say thank you," Neville continued, "for everything, the supplies, the sanctuary, the belief that we were worth saving." "You were," Aberforth said gruffly. Don't sell yourself short just because the war's over." Neville smiled, tired but genuine. "Gran wants you to come for dinner. Sunday. She says it's not optional. Your Gran is a tyrant. She says the same about you." Neville moved toward the door, then paused. "Marcus Flint survived, by the way. Fought in the battle. Saved a Muggle-born 4th year from a Death Eater. I thought you'd want to know." Aberforth nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." After Neville left, Aberforth stood before Ariana's portrait one final time, studying the sister who'd never gotten to see Hogwarts at peace, never gotten to know what she'd helped protect. "We did it," he told her softly. "All of us together. You most of all." The portrait smiled, and in the morning light streaming through clean windows, she looked almost alive, almost free. And in the Hog's Head Inn, an old man poured 2 drinks, one for himself, one for memory, and allowed himself, just this once, to believe that redemption wasn't just possible. It was already here,